The Lada Niva is one of the few Soviet vehicles that truly became accepted in the West. It was sold across Western Europe and in many other markets outside the Eastern Bloc. It was used by farmers, fishermen, municipal services, and by anyone who needed a simple and affordable off-road vehicle. However, far less is known about another part of its history: its participation in the Paris-Dakar Rally. The Lada Niva took part in this marathon from the very beginning, and it was not a factory-backed team. The cars were driven not by Soviet racers, but by French private drivers. At the same time, the vehicles that entered the race remained very close to their production versions. And despite this, they consistently reached the finish line and often fought for strong positions. As a result, the Niva gained a solid reputation among rally raid enthusiasts. And one French dealer of Soviet cars was even inspired by this story to create special versions of the model. But let's go step by step and start from the very beginning. Without the French Lada importer, the entire African story of the Niva would most likely never have happened. Jacques Poch, owner of the importing company, represented Škoda and Moskvich in France, and from 1972, he also represented Lada. At the same time, he was a passionate motorsport enthusiast and had been competing in races since the early 1950s. Poch clearly understood a principle long known in the automotive industry: win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Sporting success increased not only sales, but also brand status, especially when it came to cars from socialist countries. In many Western European countries, such vehicles were often purchased primarily for their affordability, rather than prestige or image. Therefore, participation, and especially strong results in major international competitions, could significantly change public perception. A similar effect had already been seen before. The Moskvich 412 performed successfully in the London to Sydney Marathon and the London to Mexico World Cup Rally, which allowed Poch to derive substantial commercial benefit from the achievements of the Soviet export organization Avtoexport. When the Niva appeared, many Western buyers began to look at the Lada brand in a new way. In terms of consumer qualities, the Lada Niva, with permanent all-wheel drive, a low-range gearbox, and a locking center differential, truly had serious off-road capability. At the same time, it offered a level of comfort that, while not luxurious, was comparable to that of a regular passenger car. In its price category, it had almost no direct competitors at the time. It is not surprising that Jacques Poch, like other Western European importers, quickly established Niva deliveries to France. Almost simultaneously with the European debut of the Lada Niva in 1978, French motorcycle racer Thierry Sabine conceived a bold and largely adventurous idea: a rally that would start in Paris and finish in Dakar, the capital of Senegal. This would allow participants to test themselves and their vehicles in the famously treacherous African sands. The idea clearly appealed to motorized adventurers from around the world. Around 170 cars and motorcycles were entered in the first Paris-Dakar Rally. 5 of them started the race in Nivas. The most interesting part was that none of these crews represented either a Soviet team or the French importer. All of them were private entrants. They had simply bought new, almost unknown Soviet off-road vehicles and chosen them as affordable equipment for the new rally raid. As a result, the cars differed little from standard production models: a welded roll cage, an enlarged fuel tank, additional underbody protection, and reinforced suspension. Under the hood, there was still the same standard 80-horsepower engine from the Lada. In this form, the Niva had to cover nearly 10,000 kilometers across desert, dirt roads, and rough terrain, competing on equal terms with much more expensive and powerful vehicles. Of course, not all Nivas reached the finish. Out of the 5 crews that started the race, only 2 managed to reach the capital of Senegal. One finished 28th overall, the other 42nd. However, in reality, this result was far more significant than it may seem today. The regulations of the first Paris-Algiers-Dakar Rally did not include any class divisions. Cars, motorcycles, and trucks were all classified in a single overall ranking. As a result, final positions were shared among all participants. At the same time, The conditions of the first race, to put it mildly, left much to be desired. The rally turned out to be not only extremely difficult, but also poorly organized. Many crews struggled even with access to water and food. There was no proper technical support at all. The vehicles were both race cars and mobile workshops at the same time. Everything necessary, supplies, tools, and spare parts, had to be carried on board. Apparently for the crew of car number 132, this test proved too harsh. Despite finishing 28th overall, Pierre Menonzio and Jean-Louis Ledantou sold their Niva immediately after the finish, right in Senegal. The second car, number 107, which finished 42nd, did manage to return. Jacques Poch helped make this possible. He paid for the vehicle's return transport in exchange for a detailed report from Christian Dubosc on how the Niva had performed throughout the entire route. The relatively successful debut of amateur racers in Soviet vehicles at the 1979 Dakar gave Jean-Jacques Poch a clear idea. In the next race, he needed to enter his own factory-style team. For Dakar 1980, a special vehicle was prepared under starting number 128, the Niva Proto. The level of modifications was much more serious. Engine power was increased to about 110 horsepower, and a professional driver, Jean-Claude Briavois, was put behind the wheel. In total, 8 crews in Soviet off-road vehicles took part in the second Dakar. In the early stages, the results of Poch's team looked very promising. The Niva was setting the fastest times, but already in Algeria, the crew was forced to retire due to a mechanical failure. At the same time, privateer André Trossat managed to bring his car to the finish and placed 19th overall. Despite the retirement, this short but impressive performance did not go unnoticed. The Niva began to be taken seriously. Compared to its competitors, the affordable Soviet off-roader no longer looked like an easy target. Permanent all-wheel drive, strong suspension, and relatively low weight allowed it to pass difficult sections at speed, in places where others were forced to slow down. In 1981, Poch entered the Niva again, this time increasing engine displacement to 1.8 liters. This made it possible to extract about 140 horsepower from the Lada-based engine, almost twice as much as in the production version. This time, however, the team was let down not by the car, but by navigation. Because of an incorrect interpretation of the roadbook, Briavois lost a lot of time and at one point even stopped in the middle of a stage with an empty fuel tank. The situation was made worse by numerous punctures, as each wheel change cost valuable minutes. Nevertheless, the French driver managed to catch up with the race leader, René Metge, in a Range Rover. Victory was almost within reach, but at the decisive moment, the radiator failed. A leak appeared on the Niva with starting number 157. As a result, instead of first place, the Lada Poch team finished only 3rd overall. Even so, it was a serious achievement, both for the French drivers and for the Soviet vehicle. In 1982, 2 crews from Poch's team competed in the Dakar. In total, a record number of Lada Nivas, around 24, lined up at the start. Victory that year went to the Moreau brothers. The basis of their success was a 170-horsepower Renault 20-turbo 4x4 and extensive experience in African rally raids. Poch's team finished 2nd overall, a more than respectable result. However, by the 1983 season, Jacques and Jean-Jacques Poch came to the conclusion that the Soviet engine had almost reached its limit. A decision was made to carry out a heart transplant, installing a 2.4-liter Simca engine. Originally, this engine was turbocharged, but for the sake of reliability, the turbo was abandoned. The Niva had to be not only fast, but also capable of surviving long-distance endurance. The conversion was carried out by the company Morelec, owned by Marcel Morel, a participant in the 1981 Dakar, who had himself competed in a Niva with a French engine. As a result, the mid-mounted engine produced around 200 horsepower. But even this did not seem sufficient to the Poch brothers. In search of additional seconds, the car was lightened. Fiberglass doors, hood, and trunk lid were installed. The vehicle also received more powerful brakes and upgraded electrical systems. By Dakar 1983, the Niva already differed noticeably from the production version. The relatively free technical regulations allowed such modifications, and the team made full use of this opportunity. 3 Lada Poch crews entered the race that year. All of them received constant technical support from their own service team throughout the entire distance. Unfortunately, hopes for victory once again failed to materialize. Because of electrical problems, the all-female crew of Martine de Courtans and Anne-Marie de Balabre retired early. Technical issues also pushed Jean-Claude Briavoine down to 36th place. At the same time, the Niva, driven by André Trossat, finished second, and this was the maximum that could realistically be achieved. The lack of victory was not the driver's fault. First, the short wheelbase car was already operating at the limit of its capabilities. Second, competitors from the Mercedes-Benz team repaired their G-Class in violation of the regulations and were later supposed to be disqualified. However, the representatives of Lada Poch did not file a protest. The team accepted the result and once again settled for Dakar silver. In the following years up to 1988, Poch's crews continued to compete in Nivas. The cars were constantly upgraded, the wheelbase was extended, suspensions were heavily modified, carbon fiber was introduced, and engine power continued to grow. At one point, it reached around 300 horsepower, but even this proved insufficient. By the mid-1980s, the Dakar itself had changed. After the death of Thierry Sabine in 1986, the rally finally transformed from a semi-professional adventure into a world-class competition, with factory teams, serious budgets, and intense rivalry. Yes, the later Poch prototypes barely resembled the early Niva protos. In terms of performance, they surpassed anything used by the pioneers of the late 1970s. But in the new reality, that was no longer enough. Against machines such as the Porsche 959 and the Peugeot 205 T16, even a heavily modified Niva could no longer compete on equal terms. And it did not help that drivers of the caliber of Pierre Lartigue or Jackie Ickx were sometimes behind the wheel. It is telling that throughout this entire period, the Lada factory provided almost no support to Poch's team. The management's logic was simple. The Niva was already selling well, and in their view, advertising through Dakar could not significantly affect demand. At the same time, participation in the rally required serious financial resources, while the potential effect seemed uncertain. From the perspective of factory managers, this decision appeared rational. But in hindsight, it is clear that the Soviet side seriously underestimated the potential of this project. The sporting successes of the Lada Niva in the early 1980s noticeably increased interest among French buyers, not only in the Niva itself, but also in other Lada models. Poch actively took advantage of this. In his best years, he sold up to 24,000 Ladas annually in France. However, due to a number of circumstances, the Lada Poch crews never managed to win the Dakar itself. First place remained out of reach. There is a certain irony in this. In other African endurance rallies, such as the Rallye de Pharaon and the Rallye de l'Atlas, the same Nivas achieved repeated victories. But in the main race of its era, the Soviet off-road vehicle was never able to take that final, decisive step. In the 1990s, the factory team made another attempt to return to Dakar, this time with the racing prototypes Lada Niva T3 and Lada Samara T3. They took part in the Paris-Dakar Rally. However, in the overall standings, the Russian crews finished only 41st. Moreover, formally, this was not a fully factory-backed team, but a project carried out in cooperation with the same Jacques Poch. In practice, the story repeated itself. Enthusiasm, individual successful solutions, and a lack of systematic support at the manufacturer level. Almost at the same time, another Soviet project appeared at Dakar, the team of Kamaz. Unlike the Niva program, for which participation in the marathon had always remained a secondary direction, in Naberezhny Chelny, the rally was treated as a strategic task. With serious investment, an in-house engineering base, and a long-term development program. That is why the result turned out to be fundamentally different. The story of the Niva at Dakar is a story of French private initiative, persistence, and technical boldness, confronted with limited resources and the cautious position of the factory. It managed to go very far, but without full factory support, it could not go all the way.